and opportunities. What is it that's going on in EdTech? Because the things are always changing. Things have moved a lot since COVID. And what are the opportunities going forward? So, Chris, tell people where they can get hold of you.
You can get hold of me personally on LinkedIn is the best place. I'm the guy looking to the right with the blue background and a bag hanging behind me in a tree. I can tell anyone that story if they want.
I believe that you're something like the owner of some rucksack or something.
It's the world's greatest rucksack, in my opinion. There are other types and brands of rucksack out there, but in my opinion, it's the world's greatest rucksack.
So anybody who's watching this, go to Chris Toyne's LinkedIn profile. You'll see what we're talking about.
Perfect. And I'll not ruin any more of that story for now. You can also find Accelerate, who I am one of the co-founders at www.goaccelerate.org if you're interested.
So you've been in, I mean, as we were going live, you've been in the EdTech sector for years, haven't you?
Yeah, I lose count, 22, 23 maybe, with, if we count work experience, which doesn't happen that often in schools anymore, but if you count work experience, I also had 2 weeks of EdTech experience or tech experience in education.
I went and worked in a hotel because people thought I was going to go into catering.
Yeah,
there's an exclusive. That's an exclusive there.
I didn't know that. I wanted to be a chef. That was my.
Is that right? Yeah, I worked. Yeah. See, I worked in a pub.
Yeah.
And therefore, what were you going to go and be a chef? I said, no, I don't want to be a chef.
Yeah. It was when I realised how unsociable the hours were.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so what's been going on in terms of EdTech? Because there's been massive changes because COVID must have changed a lot of things. Because all of a sudden we're merrily working in classrooms, and then all of a sudden we're working from home.
Yeah, it's created a lot of opportunity, but also a lot of challenges in the immediate term. So schools tend to be 5 years-ish behind the rest of the world in terms of technology. So they tend to have older equipment, slower speed internet, all that sort of stuff. It tends to be 3 to 5, in some cases 7 or 8 years behind everyone else.
Sorry, I probably should have said. So EdTech is basically selling to schools, isn't it? You're selling to schools, universities,
yes,
colleges, that sort of stuff.
That's right. Yeah. So EdTech is really a combination of educational practices and technology to, in its simplest form, improve outcomes for children, teachers, schools, and more recently, wider school communities. So key stakeholders such as parents, governors, etc. And obviously, COVID came along. Nobody's in schools. We've all got to work from home, and schools had to scramble around. So there were initial challenges around COVID in relation to some of that technology that they had that was outdated. Now, it depends which side of the fence you sit on. So if you sit on the school side, that's a big challenge. You sit on the provider side, that's a big opportunity because these schools have got to get up and running pretty quickly. But over COVID, so if we stick to, and I'll talk about challenges in a bit if we get there, but if we stick to the provider side, over the period of COVID, or as a result of COVID, the EdTech sector has grown by 72%.
Wow.
And the UK market attracts 41% of all EdTech investment in Europe. So we're talking about a big opportunity that's been realised.
So even though the budgets probably relatively are small, actually it's a big opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it depends what we deem a budget for EdTech as well, I think. So most people would deem an EdTech budget as a spend on software or services that improve outcomes. But some schools will have budgets, wider tech budgets for equipment as well. So I guess that 72% will be higher if we take into account technology spend, because there will have definitely been teachers out there using antiquated equipment, which means they couldn't put lessons online, etc., etc. And that's seen a lot of disruption, to be fair. There's elements of EdTech that's been nailed down by big players for as long as I can remember. So you think of Capita and Sims, they had all of the UK market just about in terms of management information systems and that type of edtech. We're now seeing players come into that space who are taking 3 out of 4 of every sale now. So, and I'm not saying that's directly as a result of COVID. They'd been around prior to that. But when you've got office staff who need to work from home, who are used to working a certain way with servers in their office and nothing online and no cloud-based platform, they certainly made decisions based off the difficulties and challenges that they had throughout COVID to move to a cloud-based, more modern offering. So yeah, it's definitely facilitated some disruption as well.
I remember when COVID struck, and up until that point, the NHS, for example, if you went to them and said, can we, first of all, can I see a doctor through Zoom or online? The answer would be no. You have to do it face to face. And then they'd say, we don't have the technology to do it. And then COVID struck, and all of a sudden, the government just wrote a check, and everybody in the NHS was suddenly online.
Yeah.
And now you can't get a face-to-face meeting with the doctor. You have to do it online.
Yeah, and it's so parents' evenings are all online now. Both of mine. From my experience, yeah, the vast majority of parents' evenings are online, and I think there are some benefits to that as a working parent. There are some disadvantages. There's something to be said about meeting people face to face as well, I think. But one of the challenges. So if I think about how schools have interacted with parents, one of the challenges that was presented throughout COVID was the disparity between offering from schools. So obviously I'm not going to name any schools, but my daughters at the time were in different schools. One of them really nailed the home learning aspect. There were online lessons really quick. There was support for parents really quick. There was packs flying around all over the place. I knew she was getting less disruption in her learning to my other daughter, who kind of a forgotten year where they weren't in the key years of her education at that stage. Everything was a lot slower. She missed a lot of her learning. So there was definitely a challenge for parents and children that might stick around for a long time in terms of lost learning as a result of COVID. And again, some of that's probably down to the technology. So if they've got poorer technology, they can't scramble and cater for learning as quickly.
I remember being in France on holiday when there was the in 2020 when they announced that all of the exam results were going to be delivered by the teachers were going to say what the exam results, or was it there was AI was going to do it or whatever. And I remember listening and people were saying that ultimately people find their own level.
Yeah. I'm a fan of teacher assessment, if I'm honest. So I've worked in education for years and years and years, and I've always struggled with everything you've learned for, year 1 through to year 11 comes down to what you can remember in an hour and a half exam. So I'm a big fan of teacher assessment, and I thought that was a good thing. And interestingly, the results went up. And they've now come back down to pre-COVID levels, and we're now having conversations about results pre and post-COVID and during COVID and all that sort of stuff. I don't think we should be having those conversations. I think we should be having a conversation around, why is it different and which is the right way to do it. Because if
there's been a discussion, isn't there? Because what's happened is that the people that had the high results went into university, and then actually there's been a high dropout rate of the people going to university. So there's also this argument about that maybe that they were over quoted and therefore they got into university courses that they shouldn't have been on. But ultimately, people find their own level.
Yeah, it balances out. So I don't think it's to do with inflated results. I think it's to do with just a different system. And like you say, people finding a level. We'll probably never find it now because we've gone back to the old system. So that'll level out again eventually. But I would have liked to have seen teacher assessment stay with maybe some sort of test or assessment that helps moderate the teacher assessment, rather than we've just gone back to it's a test and that's the outcome of the assessment.
So we've now come out of COVID. So what are the challenges and opportunities? And I'm just going to do a timestamp. So we're talking on the 26th of September 2023.
Yeah.
And we've had the last 2 weeks of an announcement that there is dodgy concrete in some schools.
Yeah.
And in fact, that some of the schools have had to close, so that those schools have actually had to go back to doing online or get alternative buildings or something. So there's still challenges going on.
Oh, definitely. We're probably a better placed as well, aren't we, as a result of COVID for those challenges?
We would have thought so, yes.
But we're talking a small number, I think. In the grand scheme of things, we're talking a small number in terms of call it RAC, RAAC.
Yeah.
And I can't for the life of remember what it stands for, but they call it.
No, it's a particular type of concrete, but I understand a lot of them. I think it's 127, and a lot of them are in Essex, aren't they?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So in terms of challenges and opportunities as a result of COVID, so there's 3 or 4 main, I think, challenges that came out of COVID from a provider perspective. So during COVID, there was a government initiative. They set up something called the Oak Academy, I believe it was called, and they developed really quickly and really effectively, to be fair, a lot of curriculum content that was pushed out to schools to make sure that children who were learning at home were learning the right things in relation to the curriculum. At the time, we also had a lot of curriculum providers in that edtech space who were pushing out curriculum content that was paid for, and it's one example of a number of like small or medium-sized government initiatives that were designed to support through COVID that have impacted on businesses throughout the COVID period. That's now tipped into, originally they were, I don't know if ring fence is the right term, but I can't think of a better one, but a ring fence around what was going to be done with the Oak Academy materials. And that ring fence meant that they would only be provided in the UK. That ring fence has now been removed, so they are now providing internationally. So some of these smaller providers who'd moved their content into an international space to try and stay afloat have now got challenges around that and the influx of free or cheaper materials, but also high quality being pushed into the international space. So that was a challenge around the scramble to provide shared and free content for providers. Budgets constraints, obviously. Budgets were tight pre-COVID, but when you place that requirement on schools to go and buy a load of new tech, the budgets are squeezed even further. And that, I mean, I've mentioned poor tech, but the budget constraints are compounded by not just that, but by reduced staffing, lower parental engagement, and dare I say, a class divide as well. So wherever you're talking about spend, class divide obviously comes into it. So some parents have got better technology at home than others for obvious reasons. So that was a big challenge. Recruitment and retention post-COVID. I mean, it was a challenge before COVID, but post-COVID, it's probably an even bigger challenge, and that leads to lower adoption rates. So,
and that's basically recruiting teachers.
Yeah, recruitment and
getting them trained and
education staff in general. But yeah, teachers is the big one. But I work with edtech providers who have deliberately geared up their system so that it can be administered and supported by anyone in school. And we're now seeing teaching assistants leaving the profession as well. I mean, you can go and earn as much, if not more, in B&M, McDonald's, Home Bargains as you would do as a teaching assistant, which is obviously appealing. And that does lead to low adoption rates with technology. And the reason for that is all the people who know how to use it and know how to administer it are leaving. So then you've got to reskill and retrain, etc. And I think there's something about perception as well, post-COVID. So I've worked in sales for a large part of my career, so I'll be really careful what I say. But I think when there's big money on the table, sometimes bad behaviours are exhibited in terms of sales. And the genuine figure, this, I'm looking at it because I've got it wrote down. In terms of perception, only 8% of educators trust the claims that have been made by edtech companies. And back to normal means that they reflect as well. So we're now moving back towards a more normal state. Teachers are reflecting on what they used during COVID. And that probably supports that 8% of educators trust the claims that edtech companies have made. So all sorts of claims will have been made. If they've not been realised through COVID, as we get back to normal and we reflect, we start to realise that those claims weren't substantiated. And then I think a big one, and I'll move on to overcoming those challenges in a minute because I don't want to be negative. But a big one is COVID made everyone really accessible, didn't it? So we all learned how to use Zoom, or Teams or Google, etc. And it made everyone accessible, which is great, and I think probably a big benefit of COVID. But the danger is when everyone becomes accessible, if we don't exhibit the proper behaviours, there's a battening down of the hatches. And I've definitely seen that in schools. So getting hold of the people you need to speak to is harder than it's ever been. And I think some of that is as a result of we maybe abused that accessibility during COVID a little bit. But overcoming them, like I say, it presents a lot of challenges, a lot of opportunities as well. So we can now be creative about the solutions that we offer. I think schools are more willing than ever to talk to us about how we can help them overcome their problems. So if we're willing to have the right conversation, they're willing to talk to us about how we can overcome the problems. And I'm going to flip the accessibility bit because they can do that really easy now. We don't need to drive 300 miles to have a conversation with a head teacher. Wider stakeholders are definitely open to engagement as well. And I think if we, as EdTech providers and services, can come up with really innovative ways of engaging parents, governors, even children, the market always decides whether we've got a good solution or not. And I think we've got readily available access to wider communities as well. And to counter the 8% of educators don't trust the claims that have been made by edtech companies, 84% of teachers believe that tech has impacted positively on outcomes for children.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest opportunity as a provider of edtech. If you're working with schools and they are in that 84% who believe that your software or solution is impacting positively on outcomes for children, then we've got a real opportunity to sharpen up on our referral models. So if we're talking to schools, they believe there's an impact and we want to overcome that 8% perception, we've got an opportunity to work with schools to develop referral models. And there's nothing better in any industry, but more so in schools, I think, than a buyer recommending your solution to other
I think
buyers.
referrals in EdTech must be.
Oh yeah, it's definitely the best way to go, and we have got that opportunity. And then thinking about other opportunities that have created. So I'm working with a business at the moment who are really innovative, and they've accessed funding from something called Shine Trust. Now, I think it's been around a while, but it's designed to support educators and people in the classroom who've got great ideas to take their ideas into the marketplace. So there's now smaller groups and pockets of funding being made available for people who've had good ideas during COVID to bring those ideas to the market. So we're talking about teachers who are now supporting teachers, but in a different capacity. So yeah, plenty of opportunity as a result of some of those challenges. And Go on, sorry, Tim.
No, you go on.
Well, I was looking at the time and thinking we said 20 minutes. So I was going to summarise by saying we've got an opportunity as EdTech providers to really look forward. So we've learned a lot through COVID. And if there's one piece of advice I could give any EdTech provider, it'd be build a solution or a service for schools of tomorrow and not schools of today. So I think we've been guilty in the past of looking at the here and now, and that's why we're 5 years behind. We've got an opportunity with a load of information that we've learned to build solutions for tomorrow.
Fantastic. Chris, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about EdTech and the challenges and opportunities. And it's been a wonderful walkthrough in terms of understanding what it is and where we're going, and some great advice in the summary as well. Remind people where they can get hold of you.
They can get hold of me on LinkedIn, World's Greatest Rucksack, and also on my company website, which is www.goaccelerate.org. And thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Good. I'm glad you did, and I hope people that have got something from it.
Likewise.